Imagine this. You spend months trying to understand someone. You study their words. You analyze their actions. You excuse their contradictions because you believe every person is complicated. Yet in a single unexpected conversation, two carefully chosen questions reveal more about their soul than years of casual interaction ever could. Carl Jung believed that people rarely reveal themselves directly. They reveal themselves indirectly, through projection. The unconscious cannot remain hidden forever. It leaks into language, into emotional reactions, into the tiny moments where the carefully crafted mask loses its grip. The person standing before you is often not who they pretend to be. They are who they become when reality challenges the image they desperately protect. Most people believe deception is an act of lying. Jung understood something far more unsettling. The greatest deception is not what someone hides from others. It is what they hide from themselves. Every human being carries two identities. One is the persona, the polished face shown to society. It is disciplined, charming, generous, intelligent, compassionate. The persona knows exactly what earns approval. It survives by adaptation. The other identity lives beneath the surface. It is the shadow. The shadow remembers every rejected emotion, every hidden envy, every forbidden desire, every humiliation left unresolved. It watches silently while the persona smiles. It waits patiently for the moment when control weakens. That moment often arrives not during conflict, but during curiosity. Because the unconscious fears accusation, yet it cannot resist answering questions that seem harmless. This is why the wisest observers throughout history rarely judged people by speeches or promises. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that character reveals itself in ordinary moments, not rehearsed performances. Seneca warned that the soul becomes visible whenever comfort disappears. Jung simply explained why. Pressure exposes the unconscious. Not because people suddenly become different. Because they finally stop pretending. Perhaps you have experienced this yourself. Someone seemed incredibly kind until another person's success entered the conversation. Suddenly their smile became smaller. Their compliments became strangely qualified. They spoke politely, but something underneath their words felt sharp, almost invisible. Nothing openly cruel had been said, yet your intuition whispered that something important had just surfaced. That intuition is older than logic. Long before language evolved, human beings survived by sensing emotional incongruence. The nervous system notices what the conscious mind often ignores. Tone, hesitation, contempt disguised as humor, admiration contaminated by resentment. Your body detects fractures inside another person's character before your thoughts can explain them. Modern psychology now recognizes this through emotional attunement and subconscious pattern recognition. Jung described it through the language of archetypes. The unconscious recognizes the unconscious. This is why emotionally mature women often feel confused around manipulative people. Their mind hears kindness, but their nervous system senses danger. They wonder whether they are imagining things. They doubt themselves because the evidence appears too subtle. Yet subtle truths are still truths. The wolf does not announce itself by growling. Sometimes it simply smiles. And this is precisely where the first question quietly enters. It is almost disappointingly simple. What do you think makes someone truly successful? At first glance, it appears like ordinary conversation. There is nothing threatening about it, nothing confrontational. Most people answer immediately. But they are rarely answering the question. Instead, they are describing the architecture of their unconscious values. Watch carefully. Someone deeply grounded in inner development often speaks about integrity, peace, contribution, meaningful relationships, resilience, or purpose. Their definition extends beyond status because their identity is not dependent upon comparison. Someone dominated by the persona often speaks almost exclusively about admiration, recognition, wealth, appearance, influence, titles, or public validation. Again, none of these things are inherently wrong. The difference lies in emotional attachment. Listen not only to what they value. Listen to what they fear losing. Because every answer contains both. Jung observed that what fascinates us often controls us. When someone cannot imagine success without external approval, They reveal an unconscious dependency that eventually shapes every relationship they enter. Approval becomes survival. Validation becomes oxygen. And anyone who threatens that supply quietly becomes an enemy. This explains why some people celebrate you publicly while secretly hoping you never surpass them. Your growth destabilizes the fragile identity they spent decades constructing. The shadow interprets another person's evolution as personal humiliation. It whispers dangerous stories. If she succeeds, you become insignificant. If she is loved, you are forgotten. If she grows stronger, you become weaker. None of these stories are objectively true. Yet the unconscious experiences them as reality. That is why envy is rarely loud. It is patient. It disguises itself as concern, as advice, as realism, as subtle discouragement offered with a gentle smile. A woman walking the path of individuation eventually recognizes these emotional frequencies without needing dramatic evidence. She no longer argues with energy that consistently diminishes her. She simply observes. And observation is one of the highest forms of psychological intelligence. Because once you stop needing everyone to like you, you become capable of seeing everyone clearly. This transformation is uncomfortable, especially for women conditioned since childhood to maintain harmony at any cost. Many learned that questioning someone's motives made them judgmental, that protecting boundaries made them selfish, that trusting intuition made them irrational. So they over-explained. They forgave endlessly. They interpreted repeated disrespect as misunderstanding. Until one day they realized something profound. Compassion without discernment becomes self-abandonment. Jung never encouraged paranoia. He encouraged consciousness. To become conscious is not to assume everyone carries evil intentions. It is to recognize that every person, including yourself, carries an unconscious capable of both creation and destruction. The goal is not perfect purity. It is honest integration. Because the integrated individual acknowledges jealousy before it becomes sabotage. Acknowledges fear before it becomes control. Acknowledges pain before it becomes cruelty. The unconscious loses its power once it becomes conscious. That is the miracle of shadow work. The woman who integrates her shadow no longer needs perfection. She becomes authentic instead. Ironically, this authenticity makes manipulation far more difficult. Manipulators thrive on predictable emotional hunger. They search for women desperate to be understood, chosen, rescued, admired. But the woman who has already chosen herself cannot easily be baited. She does not chase every compliment. She does not panic over every rejection. She does not surrender her intuition merely because someone appears charming. Instead, she quietly asks. She listens. She watches. And somewhere between an ordinary conversation and an unexpected silence, another person's unconscious begins revealing far more than they ever intended. Because the deepest truths rarely emerge through interrogation. They emerge through the questions that seem too innocent to matter. The second question appears even gentler than the first, yet it reaches far deeper into the architecture of the unconscious. It is simply this. Who do you admire the most, and why? Most people assume this question uncovers inspiration. Jung would suggest it uncovers projection. Every admiration is a mirror. Every hero reflects an unlived possibility hidden inside the observer. When someone speaks passionately about another human being, they unknowingly reveal what their own soul has been searching for. Some admire power because they secretly fear powerlessness. Some admire beauty because they have never believed themselves worthy of love. Some admire wealth because scarcity has become their deepest emotional language. Some admire wisdom because chaos has exhausted them. None of these desires are shameful. The revealing part is not what they admire. It is why. The unconscious always completes the sentence before the conscious mind realizes it has begun speaking. Listen carefully when someone explains their admiration. Do they speak about character? Or do they speak only about outcomes? Do they admire courage because it protects truth? Or because courage dominates other people? Do they admire confidence because it creates peace? Or because it attracts attention? The words may sound almost identical. The emotional frequency beneath them is completely different. This is where many women begin awakening from one of the oldest illusions they have ever believed. The illusion that charisma and character are the same thing. They are not. Charisma is energy. Character is direction. A hurricane has enormous energy. It does not possess wisdom. Throughout history, humanity has repeatedly mistaken intensity for integrity. The loudest voice becomes the leader. The most confident speaker becomes the expert. The most charming smile becomes the safest place. Yet Jung repeatedly reminded his students that the unconscious is attracted to symbols before it recognizes substance. The persona understands symbols. Expensive clothing. Perfect vocabulary. Calm posture. Social influence. Endless confidence. The persona carefully arranges these pieces like an actor preparing for the stage. But maintaining a mask consumes tremendous psychological energy. Eventually, exhaustion arrives. Eventually, reality interrupts the performance. Eventually, the shadow demands expression. This is why relationships often change after months or years. Not because people suddenly become someone else. Because pretending became too expensive. Perhaps you have known someone who appeared endlessly generous while life remained easy. They encouraged everyone, supported every dream, celebrated every achievement. Then hardship arrived. A financial setback. A professional disappointment. A painful rejection. Suddenly, their generosity disappeared. Patience became irritability. Compassion became criticism. Kindness became emotional withdrawal. Many people describe this by saying, they change. Psychologically speaking, something more precise occurred. Their persona weakened. Their shadow surfaced. Pressure does not manufacture character. Pressure reveals it. This truth becomes especially important for women who naturally empathize with suffering. Empathy is beautiful. But empathy without boundaries often mistakes explanation for transformation. You understand why someone behaves destructively. You understand their childhood wounds. You understand their trauma. You understand their fear. And because you understand, you stay. You wait. You hope. You convince yourself that awareness alone will heal them. But understanding another person's pain does not obligate you to become its lifelong container. Jung emphasized that healing cannot occur without consciousness. No one evolves simply because someone else loves them enough. Transformation begins only when responsibility replaces blame. That is why the second question quietly exposes something profound. When someone describes the people they admire, notice whether they admire responsibility or excuses. Do they speak respectfully about those who overcame hardship? Or do they endlessly glorify victims while refusing accountability? The answer reveals the direction of their psychological growth. A person walking toward individuation naturally respects truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. A person imprisoned by the shadow seeks comfort before truth. Comfort says, nothing is your fault. Truth says, your wounds explain you, but they do not excuse you. The difference separates maturity from emotional stagnation. This is one reason emotionally manipulative individuals often become uncomfortable around psychologically integrated women. They expect sympathy. Instead, they encounter clarity. Not cruelty. Not judgment. Simply clarity. And clarity cannot be manipulated for long. There comes a moment in every woman's life when she realizes she has spent years asking the wrong questions. She asked, does he love me? Does he miss me? Will he change? What did I do wrong? These questions keep attention trapped outside the self. The unconscious quietly builds dependence through endless uncertainty. But individuation begins the moment the questions change. What patterns keep repeating? What truth am I avoiding? What part of myself keeps accepting less than I deserve? Suddenly, the entire psychological landscape transforms. The search is no longer for perfect people. The search becomes inner discernment. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that another person's character belongs to them. His own response belonged to him. This simple distinction protects emotional freedom. Because suffering multiplies whenever you confuse responsibility. Someone else's dishonesty is not your failure. Someone else's betrayal is not your identity. Someone else's inability to love deeply is not evidence that you are unworthy. These truths sound obvious. Yet millions spend decades unconsciously arguing against them. Why? Because the inner child often believes love must be earned, not received. Many women who repeatedly attract emotionally unavailable partners are not cursed. They are unconsciously recreating familiar emotional environments. The nervous system mistakes familiarity for safety, even when familiarity hurts. Especially when childhood taught that affection always arrived alongside unpredictability. Modern trauma psychology explains this through attachment patterns. Jung described it through unconscious repetition. Both point toward the same destination. Until the unconscious becomes conscious, it chooses yesterday while believing it is choosing tomorrow. This is why awareness feels so revolutionary. One conversation, one unexpected answer, one quiet observation, and suddenly years of confusion begin making sense. The woman who once ignored subtle warning signs now notices them almost immediately. Not because she has become suspicious, because she has become present. Presence is astonishingly difficult to deceive. Manipulators rely upon distraction, upon emotional urgency, upon overwhelming charm, upon making decisions happen before reflection catches up. Presence interrupts that process. Presence slows everything down. Presence notices inconsistency. Presence recognizes when words and energy refuse to agree. Perhaps the greatest psychological shift occurs when a woman finally understands that discernment is not cynicism. Discernment does not assume the worst in everyone. It simply refuses to ignore what repeatedly reveals itself. It allows kindness to exist without blindness, compassion without self-sacrifice, love without self-erasure. The integrated woman no longer feels compelled to rescue every wounded soul she encounters. She recognizes something that Carl Jung understood with remarkable precision. Not every person wants healing. Some only want witnesses for the story they refuse to change. And no amount of patience can transform someone who remains committed to unconsciousness. So she continues asking gentle questions. Not because she seeks flaws. Because truth deserves enough silence to emerge on its own. Silence has a peculiar way of unsettling those who depend upon performance. A psychologically integrated woman eventually discovers that she no longer needs to fill every pause with reassurance. She does not rush to rescue awkward conversations. She does not immediately explain herself when misunderstood. She allows space to exist. And space is where masks begin to crack. The persona thrives on constant motion. It survives by controlling impressions, predicting reactions, shaping narratives before anyone has the opportunity to question them. But silence removes that control. In silence, the unconscious begins searching for escape. This is why some people become strangely uncomfortable when conversations slow down. Notice what happens after someone answers those two seemingly innocent questions. Do they become curious about you? Or do they immediately redirect the conversation back toward themselves? Do they listen? Or merely wait for another opportunity to perform? Listening is one of the rarest psychological abilities because genuine listening requires the temporary surrender of the ego. The ego wants to impress. The self wants to understand. Jung distinguished between the ego and the deeper self with extraordinary precision. The ego is necessary. It organizes identity, creates stability, helps navigate the world. But when the ego believes it is the entire personality, life becomes a never-ending campaign for superiority. Every interaction becomes competition. Every disagreement becomes a threat. Every successful woman becomes a comparison. Every criticism becomes an attack. Such individuals rarely recognize this consciously. Instead, they sincerely believe the world is constantly judging them. And because they assume judgment everywhere, they unconsciously begin judging everyone first. Projection becomes protection. This explains why certain people seem unusually skilled at identifying flaws in others. They quickly notice arrogance, yet secretly hunger for admiration. They condemn selfishness, yet quietly expect everyone to accommodate them. They criticize dishonesty, yet manipulate facts whenever accountability approaches. Jung famously observed that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This statement is often misunderstood. It does not mean every accusation is projection. Sometimes harmful behavior is genuinely harmful. But repeated emotional intensity often reveals unfinished work within the observer. When someone reacts disproportionately, the unconscious has usually entered the conversation. Perhaps you have experienced this. A harmless comment triggered an unexpectedly defensive response. A gentle boundary created overwhelming anger. A respectful disagreement somehow transformed into a personal attack. From the outside, the reaction appeared irrational. Psychologically, it was deeply logical. The shadow had been touched. The unconscious defends itself with remarkable creativity. It changes the subject. It creates confusion. It rewrites history. It assigns blame. It exaggerates your intentions. Anything except direct self-examination. This is why manipulative personalities often become masters of emotional inversion. The guilty become victims. The wounded become offenders. The truthful become too sensitive. The courageous become difficult. The woman protecting her peace suddenly becomes accused of being cold. Not because she has changed. Because the relationship depended upon her abandoning herself. Once she stops, the entire emotional system becomes unstable. This moment often feels heartbreaking. Especially for women who genuinely wanted harmony. They wonder whether boundaries have made them less loving. Whether distance has made them selfish. Whether discernment has hardened their heart. But Jung would likely ask a different question. What if your discomfort is not evidence that you are becoming cruel, but evidence that you are becoming conscious? Consciousness rarely feels comfortable at first. The cave is familiar. The sunlight requires adjustment. Individuation is not the process of becoming someone new. It is the gradual removal of everything that never truly belonged to you. The expectations. The borrowed identities. The inherited fears. The endless need to earn permission simply to exist. Many women unknowingly inherit psychological contracts written long before they were born. Be agreeable. Be beautiful. Be needed. Never intimidate. Never disappoint. Never become too successful. Never become too independent. Smile. Forgive. Accommodate. Sacrifice. Repeat. These contracts are rarely spoken aloud. Yet they quietly shape entire lifetimes. The tragedy is not that society creates these expectations. The tragedy is that the unconscious eventually mistakes them for identity. A woman begins believing she is valuable only when she is useful. Only when she is desired. Only when she is giving. Only when she is rescuing someone else. Then one day, exhaustion arrives. Not physical exhaustion. Existential exhaustion. The soul begins asking questions the ego cannot answer. Who am I when no one needs me? Who am I when applause disappears? Who am I when pleasing others no longer defines my worth? These questions frighten the persona. They liberate the self. Because beneath every false identity waits an authentic one. Not louder. Not more aggressive. Simply more real. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when we distinguish what belongs to us from what does not. Your choices belong to you. Another person's approval does not. Your integrity belongs to you. Their opinion does not. Your peace belongs to you. Their projections do not. This distinction appears simple. Living it requires extraordinary courage. Especially when manipulative individuals sense they're losing influence. They rarely announce it directly. Instead, subtle tactics emerge. They suddenly become unusually kind after prolonged neglect. They offer compliments immediately after criticism. They manufacture emergencies requiring your emotional labor. They remind you of shared history whenever you attempt to leave unhealthy dynamics. These behaviors confuse many women because they mistake inconsistency for complexity. Yet consistency, not intensity, is one of the clearest signs of mature character. Anyone can be kind when everything goes according to plan. Anyone can appear patient while receiving admiration. Anyone can promise loyalty during seasons of abundance. Character appears elsewhere. It appears when disappointment enters the room. When no audience is watching. When gratitude is absent. When power shifts unexpectedly. When saying the truth carries a personal cost. That is why the two questions matter so profoundly. Not because they function as magical tests, but because they quietly invite the unconscious to participate. And over time, patterns always reveal more than performances. The woman walking the path of individuation stops searching for perfect answers. She studies recurring patterns instead. She notices whether words consistently align with actions. Whether apologies produce changed behavior. Whether admiration transforms into resentment whenever someone else's light becomes brighter. These observations require patience. But patience guided by awareness is radically different from patience guided by denial. One protects wisdom. The other prolongs suffering. Eventually, something extraordinary begins happening. She no longer fears discovering another person's true character. Because she no longer fears honoring what she discovers. There comes a quiet morning when nothing dramatic happens, and yet everything has changed. No revelation descends from the sky. No triumphant music announces a new beginning. The woman simply notices that she is no longer exhausted by people she once believed she could never live without. The silence that once felt lonely now feels spacious. The distance that once felt frightening now feels protective. The questions that once consumed her mind have lost their power. Why? Because she has finally understood one of Jung's deepest insights. The unconscious does not seek truth. It seeks familiarity. For years, she mistook emotional intensity for intimacy. She believed that constant uncertainty meant passion. That anxiety meant love. That emotional labor meant loyalty. The shadow quietly reinforced these beliefs because they echoed old emotional landscapes, places where affection was inconsistent. Where approval had to be earned. Where peace always depended upon someone else's mood. But individuation interrupts inherited patterns. It asks a terrifying question. What if your greatest suffering has never come from other people, but from the unconscious agreements you made with yourself? Agreements like, I must never disappoint anyone. I must fix broken people. I must be chosen before I can choose myself. These silent vows shape entire lives. Most are formed long before adulthood. A little girl praised only when she is agreeable eventually becomes a woman who apologizes for having needs. A child whose emotions were ignored becomes an adult who believes expressing pain is selfish. A daughter who watched love disappear whenever conflict appeared learns to fear honesty more than loneliness. These patterns do not disappear because time passes. They disappear because consciousness expands. Jung believed that every individual eventually reaches a crossroads. One path leads toward greater adaptation. The other leads toward authenticity. Adaptation earns applause. Authenticity earns peace. The tragedy is that many never recognize the difference. They spend decades becoming increasingly successful versions of someone they were never meant to become. The persona grows stronger. The self grows quieter. Until one day the soul begins protesting. Not through words. Through anxiety. Burnout. Depression. Chronic dissatisfaction. An unexplained feeling that life has become strangely empty despite external achievements. Modern psychology often describes this as emotional exhaustion or identity diffusion. Jung recognized something deeper. The psyche was demanding integration. Not more achievement. Not another relationship. Not another promotion. Integration. The reunion between the conscious personality and the forgotten shadow. This reunion changes everything. Because once you acknowledge your own capacity for envy, manipulation, fear, pride, and insecurity, something remarkable happens. You stop being hypnotized by those same qualities in others. The manipulator no longer appears mysterious. The narcissist no longer appears powerful. The chronic victim no longer appears impossible to rescue. You recognize the patterns because you have encountered their echoes within yourself. Not as condemnation. As understanding. This is the paradox of shadow work. The more honestly you confront your own darkness, the less vulnerable you become to someone else's. The woman who has accepted her imperfections no longer feels compelled to defend an impossible image of perfection. She laughs more easily. She apologizes sincerely. She forgives without forgetting. She speaks gently without surrendering her boundaries. Most importantly, she stops confusing compassion with compliance. Many people fear boundaries because they imagine walls. Healthy boundaries are not walls. They are doors with conscious locks. The right people are welcomed. The wrong people simply lose unrestricted access. This distinction transforms relationships. Some people celebrate it. Others resent it. Those who benefited from your lack of boundaries may accuse you of becoming selfish. Those accustomed to controlling you may insist that you have changed. In one sense, they are correct. You have changed. You have stopped negotiating with your own dignity. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is not to become like the one who caused the injury. Jung might add another layer. The greatest freedom is no longer organizing your life around the person who wounded you. Because resentment is another form of attachment. Hatred keeps the psyche connected almost as strongly as love. The integrated woman eventually releases both. Not because what happened was acceptable. Because she refuses to let another person's unconscious become the architect of her future. She understands that every hour spent proving her worth to someone incapable of recognizing it is an hour stolen from becoming herself. And becoming yourself is the highest calling Jung ever described. Not becoming admired. Not becoming perfect. Not becoming universally understood. Becoming whole. Wholeness does not eliminate pain. It changes your relationship with pain. Failure becomes instruction instead of identity. Rejection becomes redirection instead of condemnation. Loneliness becomes solitude instead of abandonment. Even betrayal begins revealing unexpected gifts. It exposes illusions. It clarifies values. It teaches discernment that comfort never could. The two questions that began this journey were never really about exposing someone else. They were invitations. One invited another person's unconscious to speak. The other invited your own consciousness to awaken. Because after asking enough thoughtful questions, something surprising happens. You become less interested in controlling the answers. You simply observe. Observation replaces obsession. Discernment replaces suspicion. Wisdom replaces urgency. You stop chasing explanations from people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop demanding accountability from those who have built their identity around avoiding it. You stop searching for closure in conversations that can only produce more confusion. Instead, you trust patterns. You trust consistency. You trust the quiet intelligence of your own nervous system, no longer silenced by self-doubt. Carl Jung believed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That journey asks for courage far greater than pleasing the world. It asks you to disappoint expectations that were never yours to carry. It asks you to release identities that once kept you safe but now keep you small. It asks you to walk away from relationships that require self-betrayal as the price of belonging. And in return, it offers something no external validation can ever provide. Inner authority. The kind that cannot be purchased. Cannot be manipulated. Cannot be stolen. From that place, conversations become clearer. Relationships become simpler. Love becomes freer. Not because the world has changed, but because you have. The woman who once searched desperately for hidden signs in everyone else's behavior now recognizes the most important truth of all. A person's true character is never revealed by how convincingly they speak about virtue. It is revealed by how consistently they live it when no reward is waiting. And a woman who has integrated her shadow no longer fears discovering that truth. She welcomes it. Because every revelation, however painful, brings her one step closer to the only relationship she can never afford to lose. The one she has with herself. A woman who knows her worth does not pursue, she chooses.